Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, it's Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value or entertainment out of these videos, all I ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Obviously, a different atmosphere here today. I'm actually just away on vacation in Maui, hence the change up. We've got the beach to the right, so I'm going to keep this video relatively brief and short. But if you want sort of my in-depth thoughts on the housing market, the Saretsky Report for October 2019 is now out. That is in the description below. I'll put a link to that. So again, it is free of charge, but a lot of charts, graphs, and in-depth commentary there. So yeah, I highly encourage you to check that out. But also, what I am wanting your feedback on is I've recently, did a webinar for the Real Estate Institute of British Columbia. And it was, I think it was relatively quite successful, and the feedback was quite positive. So kind of what I'm thinking potentially moving forward. I'm not a huge fan of really monetizing an audience per se, but I do think that at the end of the day, time is money. So what I'm kind of thinking is potentially doing a quarterly webinar sort of on the Vancouver housing market, in depth, sort of charts, graphs, everything that I'm seeing. And what I'm thinking is maybe like an hour-long webinar with sort of an hour-long Q&A at the end, and probably just opening it up to the public, people of this YouTube channel, and maybe charging $40-50. And so yeah, if somebody wanted to come on and sort of get a really in-depth analysis on the housing market on a quarterly basis, I think that I would probably open that up. And yeah, again, sort of thinking in that 40 to 50 range. So if you think that might be of interest or of value, or I'm open to the feedback, good idea, bad idea, but again, I want to keep the sort of the cost relatively on the lower side, just because I'm not a huge fan of really charging per se. But again, time is money, so and I feel like that there's definitely going to be enough value there to do so, particularly with a Q&A at the end. But it's interesting because I'm getting a lot, again, as I do these videos and put out the reports, it's getting a lot more commentary that, oh, well, this guy's bullish, and what happened, and what's going on in the housing market. Yeah, sales are up, but prices are down. Again, I've talked a lot about this in my report, but I think that at the end of the day, that is again what is happening in the housing market today. Again, that's not to suggest that structurally, things, that the sort of the precautionary tale has subsided. I think again that a lot of this comes down to the labor market, which I'm watching very, very closely. That if you're looking for any sort of downturn in prices in Canadian housing, I think a lot of that is going to come through the labor market, and basically like a labor shock, i.e. Beginning to see a capex recession in the employment market, where that causes basically job layoffs, and then all of a sudden you have less credit-worthy borrowers, because right now credit is abundant. Whether you're going to banks, stress tests, that has all been sort of absorbed by the market. So mortgage credit is still readily available, as we can see in the 3-month annualized growth in residential mortgage credit growth, that's picking up. And then the private mix space, which is basically your subprime lending space, that is booming. And interesting enough, Ben Rabideau, saw him tweet this. I'm just going to read it. It says, a report from CMHC this week notes that mortgage credit outstanding at 100 mix mortgage investment corps or private lenders, they tracked increased 51% between 2006 and 2018. So basically what's that saying is the mortgage credit outstanding has been growing rapidly by 51% over the past 2 years. So basically, and this is my conversation with local mix here in Vancouver as well, is that they actually have too much money coming in, that basically they don't know where to put it. And so what we're seeing, not as much maybe in Vancouver, but I'm hearing and discussing in Toronto, is that they're actually, some of these lenders are big because there's so much money coming in and everybody's sort of competing for business, because they're actually starting to aggressively cut their mortgage rates. So they're aggressively lowering the cost of a private loan. So again, you have to remember that anyone that goes to a private lending space is because they haven't been basically approved at a big bank. So whether that's RBC or CIBC, It basically means the bank deems them not creditworthy enough that they have to then go into this lending channel space, which again is on 1 year loans, 1 year term loans that have to get basically reapproved every single year, right? So if the value of your home declines, or you get laid off, or your credit situation changes, your financial situation changes, then there's no obligation whatsoever for these private lenders to renew your mortgage. So this actually creates, again, as I've talked about before, this is a systemic risk that I believe, again, is all backed on the strength of the housing market, and particularly the strength of the labor market, because again, you're not credit worthy if you don't have a job, or if you go from full-time to part-time, etc. But as we can see right now in Canada, is wage growth is rampant, but what we're starting to see is we have wage growth rampant, but the earnings for businesses is actually is slowing. So the last thing that a business is going to do is, the last thing they can do is cut your wages. So usually what they have to do is they have to basically lay somebody off over time to get your earnings back in line, right? I mean, obviously, if you're earning less and your wages are going up, and you're not going to start hiring more people. So we're going to start to see what we're going to start to see is basically a job creation slow. And what's actually interesting, as you can see, is the number of job creation from the private hiring space. So like regular private businesses, not government, not public, the public sector. The private sector job growth has actually slowed significantly. You can see back in sort of 17, the peak, it actually has slowed dramatically and is now tipping into negative growth territory this past month. So private sector job growth is definitely a concern. The growth in Canadian labor market has actually been in the public sector, which I think a lot has to do with the recent elections and that magnitude that fiscal spending has been increasing on that aspect. So that's kind of interesting that I'm watching, and you can see that the Canadian economy, as we've talked about, I mean, the vulnerabilities are essentially that the Canadian economy is leveraged so much to the housing market, hence why I actually believe that governments will do their best attempts to try to keep housing moving forward. What you can see is residential construction, real estate services, and credit intermediation are now nearly as large as energy and manufacturing combined. So let me just say it again. Residential construction, real estate services, and credit intermediation is now essentially equivalent in GDP terms to manufacturing and the energy sector. So basically, as David Rosenberg famously calls it, the Canadian economy is built through the 3 C's. There's condos, there's cannabis, and there's crude. And we know that the cannabis sector and the crude sector are obviously in the dumps right now, but the condo sector, again, is still booming. So that's kind of the last pillar holding up the Canadian economy. So again, not going to say that that's going to tip over, but obviously we know housing is the main factor here in Canada. So yeah, that's again kind of what I'm watching this week. I don't think there's a whole lot going on. I think we're entering into the slower months where things are going to start to slow down. It's going to be a little bit less interesting. But I think if I can get your thoughts this week, again, not only go check out my latest Saretsky Report for October, but again, also your thoughts on potentially a quarterly webinar on the state of the Vancouver housing market. I don't think I would do Canada because I think that my specialty is primarily focused on Vancouver, where I feel like I can bring a lot of value to people that are navigating in that space or just want to come here and learn and ask a few questions, keeping the costs relatively low. But obviously the main driver is always bring value first, and so that will continue to be the case. So yeah, appreciate it. Hope that helped. Otherwise,